Alrighty then, ladies and gentlemen. I drew the short straw, so this is the post-lunch, you are all going to sleep for the next 60 minutes and give me a nice easy time, aren't you, slot? We apparently need to start on time because we're live streaming to the whole world. Today, Finland, tomorrow, the world. So I have you for the next 45 minutes to talk to you about, oh, that's interesting. Yes, effective Azure positioning. All right, I was obviously asleep when I typed that. Not positioning, provisioning. Gotta love autocorrect. So I'll tell you a good one about autocorrect since I've already started down this route. So we were doing this session called Living the Dream. And it was all about VSTS and Azure DevOps. So the title was DevOps with VSTS and Azure. And I tweeted that, and my phone diligently auto-corrected it to devils with arms and cats. So, since we've started well, who am I? My name is Rick Hepworth. By night, I am an Azure MVP. By day, I work for a company called Black Marble doing cloud consulting services. The important thing to remember about me, apart from the fact I'm a long-haired idiot, is that GitHub URL. And the reason that's important is because all the stuff I'm going to show you over the next 45 minutes and the slides for this are all in GitHub. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about ARM templates. This isn't really an introductory talk. I'm going to start giving you lots of opinions about writing ARM templates and the clever stuff you can do, but I thought we'd better start off with what are they, just in case. So, ARM templates are Azure's answer to infrastructure as code. They are declarative, so you say what you want, and then the magical Azure pixies go and build you what you want, rather than you having to write all of the sequence of steps to actually create stuff for you. They're idempotent, which means we can just keep throwing them at Azure, and every time we do it, exactly the same things will happen, just as we expect it to be, and the end goal is always the same. And apart from the fact that they're really cool, honest, you can do really clever stuff with them. So you can deploy some really, really complex Azure environments with an ARM template. You can call a template from another template, what they call a nested deployment. And that's really handy both from a readability point of view, and if you want to do really clever stuff with sequencing that I'll talk about in a little bit. And importantly, they're part of a healthy, balanced DevOps diet. They are not going to rule the world for you just because we've got ARM templates does not mean we're doing DevOps, but it's very hard to do Azure DevOps properly without using ARM templates. So, let's see if you're awake. So how many of you guys here think of yourselves as developers? Okay, and how many think of yourselves as IT pros? Okay, and how many just don't like putting your hand up? Cool. So for reference, because I don't know if Mike was watching, that's mostly a developer audience. I'm an IT pro, so be gentle with me. You devs need us IT pros because we provision the stuff that your code runs on. You can't live without us. We may or may not hate you. Yeah, very likewise. I like that one. Okay, so let's start with a quick demo. I am going to deploy an ARM template. So I have over here, no, don't start Outlook. I have over here a template. I always like doing this demo because what I'm going to do is I am going to deploy, right before your very eyes, a website across multiple regions in Azure with traffic manager across the top of them, with a Redis cache, with a SQL database, with some Cosmos DB. We're going to wire all of that lot together by pushing the appropriate connection string straight into the website. And I'm going to do it just by doing Control-C, Control-V. You devs will know that, right? Because it's how we all dev these days. You get a Stack Overflow, you type in the question, Stack Overflow gives you the answer, Control-C, Control-V, done. So, over here I have the glorious Azure portal, which is working, which is always a good thing. Let's make that a bit bigger. So pinned to my dashboard, I've got this thing called template deployment. If you hit new in the left-hand column and type TEMP, this thing will pop up for you. And it's a really, really useful thing that they've stuck into the portal. And I use it quite a lot when I'm working on templates for sort of validation and testing. So you can come in here and say, you know what, I just want to use a standard template. I want to create a Linux VM, or I want to pull something from the Quick Start template repository and throw that in there. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to build my own template. And I'm just going to delete that lot, paste in mine, and hit save. And we'll explain all about the templates in a moment. So it's read that template, and it's asking me some questions. So I'll zoom in a second. Basically, I'm going to create a new resource group to hold the stuff that I'm deploying. I'm going to deploy to West Europe. And then I've got a couple of parameters that I'm asking myself. So I'm just going to give it a name prefix, 3. And because I want to get off, because I want to go to more than one location, I'm going to type that in. So what have I just done? Hopefully that's a bit better. So I am going to deploy to my subscription into a resource group called Igloo 3 in Western Europe, whatever this template is going to create, which I've just told you. This template has asked me a set of questions that I've got to answer each deployment. So I'm going to call my resources something beginning with Igloo 3. I can choose what size I want the app plan size to be. I can choose my storage type. And that final bit at the end, web locations, I'm telling it I want to go to North Europe and West Europe. And I'm going to purchase. Oh, hold on. I'm not going to purchase. Somewhere in here, there we go, there's a license statement. Who owns the Azure portal? Mental note, it doesn't scale very well. Right, there we go, purchase. So, the Azure Pixies are now working in the background, and that's going to start a deployment. And up here, I've got a nice little notification saying it's deploying. Just to quickly close the loop on that, what that is going to deploy is something I prepared earlier in true Blue Peter fashion. It's going to deploy all of this lot. So a template could just throw out one thing, or it could throw out lots of things. And importantly, it does that without you needing to look at it. So you just hit go and have a coffee, come back, and everything's done. That's really useful. So let's come back to slides. And let's talk about what templates are and how they're built up. So templates have got 4 different sections. The parameters section is the one that I find the most useful and the one that people I talk to when we're helping create these things tend to get carried away with. So opinion number 1 in Rick's list of opinions about ARM templates, try and keep the number of parameters you're going to have to a reasonable, i.e. small, number. So a parameter is something that you are going to specify at deploy time. So it's the kind of thing that you might want to be changing or doing differently for certain uses of the template. And the obvious one of that is dev and test. So my developers might use my template and they want an A1 VM, but when we use the same template in production, I want a D14 or something crazy. Which brings us to one of the most important bits. Always give your parameter a default value. So over here, up here, you can see that in our parameter, I've got a name. What is the variable called? George. I've got a description, so somebody can come and look at my template and work out what that parameter is, because being able to read this as a human being is really important. But also, there's a default value. So if a developer takes my template and just pushes it to the cloud, he's going to get what he needs. In the same way as you just want to be able to take the code, hit F5 and build it and have something running that you can work on, the template should do exactly the same thing. So always make sure when you're building a template, you think about who's going to use it and put appropriate defaults in. Then we've got variables. So Variables allow you to take what you've stuffed in as a parameter and start to do clever things with it. So you can do string concatenation in templates. You can do a bit of maths if you want to. You can do, as you can see there, this thing called unique string. So if I want to deploy resources, I need to make sure that there's no namespace clash. You can't have two storage accounts with the same name, and Magnus always beats me to it when I'm trying to pick the interesting ones. So this thing called a unique string generates a pseudo-random number, I guess. It takes the ID of the resource group that I'm feeding into it and generates a random string from it. Except it's not random because a template has to be idempotent. So every time I ask it to generate that string, it's got to generate the same one. Because if it didn't, I wouldn't be able to redeploy using the template. So it gets me what I need, which is a unique name, without being totally random.
Actually, you would be able to redeploy it.
Yes. Yes, yes, and I'll beat that 120,000 a month really quickly if I'm doing that. Now, variables don't have to just be sort of name-value pair. They can be complete blocks of JSON. Ah, yes, JSON. I forgot to mention, ARM templates are written in JSON. As a language to use to code these things from first principles, that would not have been my first choice. But there we are. JSON it is. So that means I can have structures. So one of the things that I'm really keen on doing is, rather than having a gazillion variables of name and value, I always build structures, and I tend to build structures based on the resources I'm deploying. So if I'm going to have, I don't know, a website, then I'll have a variable called website with properties within it, just like you can see there. So I'll have website.name. website.skew. What that means is that when I'm looking at it in the editor, I only see sort of half a dozen variables in the UI in Visual Studio, and it's also very easy for me to work out what variable goes with what resource and how things are structured, and is just logical and readable and easy to understand. When we start talking about resources, the resources are the meat and two veg that we want to deploy. What is it that we actually want to run in Azure? In theory, all of the resources have nice, expansive APIs that we can push out properties and deploy our services through the templates. In practice, they're a little bit random. Some services are richer than others. Some are better documented than others. But pretty much, as I'll show you as I go into demos later on, there are always ways to find out what the JSON is that you need to put in place for your resource. Same thing if you're putting stuff in your template to deploy resources, a few top tips. So you'll see at the top there that my resource has a name, which is a variable. Now when I'm looking at that in the editor, in Visual Studio, I get a really nice JSON viewer that I'll show you in a bit. And it's really hard to parse a template if I just have a list of resources whose name is variable something name. Whereas if I put a tag in, you see there's a tag section in the middle down here, hold on. That says tags display name. And display name is what turns up in the Visual Studio editor. So I can then start to give my resources in the template a name that means more to me as the person who owns the system. So rather than, Azure website, it might be, this is the e-commerce front end, or, this is our back-end API site, or something like that. And then we've got the various bits of data that the particular resource needs to be able to deploy. Important thing to call out here, you'll notice there's an API version. So the Azure guys are really, really good. I can declare an API version, and every time I deploy that template, I will get what I specified in that API version. If they advance things forward, I've got to use the new API to use the cool new features. They keep those API versions for a very long time, unless they end in preview. API versions that end in preview might go away. So be careful if you're using resources that are using a preview API, that you will have to do some regular housekeeping of those templates and make sure those APIs are still current. But we all maintain our templates anyway, don't we? And then finally, it's okay throwing this template at Azure and getting our stuff deployed, but maybe we want to know some things about what it's done. If I've deployed a SQL database, maybe I need the connection string passed back to me. Maybe I need the URI for my storage account, because it might be that I'm calling this template from a script and I want to then pass that connection string into the next step of the script. I might also want to pass things between templates if I'm doing nested deployments. So outputs are your friend there. And inside that block of code there, you'll find it says reference. And basically what I'm doing there is I've defined an output called website hostname, and that's taking a property. So it's looking at a reference to a resource, which is the website that I've defined elsewhere in the template for this example, finding its hostname property and passing it back as the value of the output. And if I execute this template using PowerShell, what I actually get is a really nice object back where I can explore and I'll see the outputs and their properties. Reference is also an incredibly useful thing to do, because that's how you can start to say, I want to set the property of my website, like you can set connection strings, for example, in your website. I can set that to a reference of the connection string of the SQL DB that I've just deployed. And I'm a big fan of trying, as the guy who's deploying the infrastructure, to do as much of the plumbing as I can, so we don't have to start worrying about putting configuration files in these things that might end up in source control. So that's kind of a summary of some of the tips that I've been working through as I've just been talking. A couple that I haven't mentioned yet. Enormous templates don't really help. A couple of times recently, a few friends have said, do you mind having a look at my template? It's not deploying properly. Here is my 20,000 line template. Whatever, so, I mean, there is a maximum size for a template. Unfortunately, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But the most important thing for me is these things actually really need to be human readable. So split it apart and use nested deployments for readability. Use clear and sensible names for everything that makes sense to your team, not just you, when you're naming variables and resources and that kind of stuff. And one that's potentially a little bit controversial, I hate, detest, do not use, and I hurt my developers if they do, parameters JSON. So when you deploy a template, you can say the parameters that are listed in this template, here is another file, another JSON file that contains the answers to that template. Brilliant. That puts us exactly back to where we don't want to be, which is some idiot developer changes something, checks the JSON file into source control, and breaks my release pipeline. So I always make sure that we enter the parameters at deploy time through the tooling we're using to deploy the template. So if it's through the Azure portal like you watched me, I type stuff in. If it's PowerShell, it goes on the command line. If it's a release pipeline, it goes in the release step that pushes out the template. And the other thing that I've learned and sort of accepted with resignation is to accept that my template will be called Azure deploy.json. I railed against this for quite a while, but there are so many things starting to come along now that look for a file called Azure deploy when it's looking for a template. Azure Dev Test Labs is the most obvious, where you can tell a Dev Test Lab to look in a Git repo, and it will show you a really nice list of resources that you can deploy within your Dev Test Lab, so long as each one is called Azure deploy.json. If it isn't, it won't find it. And my final tip down there, I'm going to show you this in a minute. Resource Explorer, if you are working on templates, will be your new best friend. Irrespective of which development tools you decide to use, Resource Explorer is the best thing to figure out how you actually build a template itself. So, let's switch to another demo and talk about how we might actually start to build our templates. So you might think at this point, I'm going to go and open a code editor and all that kind of stuff. Well, you can, if you want, just start with an empty Visual Studio project. And to be fair, sort of out of habit, I do still tend to do that. Or Visual Studio Code, or Vi, or Emacs if you hate yourself. But what most of us actually really want to do is we want to prototype, don't we? We want to go, well, we're not really sure what this is going to look like. Let's go in the Azure portal, let's deploy a bunch of resources, get it sort of configured how we want, and then I'd like to sort of templatize that. Can I do that? Sort of. So, if I come in here, I'm in the Azure portal now, and I'm sitting inside that resource group that looks like the one I deployed. And if I just zoom in here, in that very, very long left-hand menu, you'll find this thing called automation script, which is great, because it might be automation, but it's definitely not a script. But there we go. And if I click automation script, what happens is the portal goes and talks to the control plane in Azure, and the control plane asks all the different resource providers, says, hey, please provide me the JSON that describes the resource that you've got there, so I can combine it in a template. Thanks very much. Your mileage may vary on this one. So, the first thing you will notice on this one, if I zoom in, this actually looks very similar to the way the Visual Studio shows everything. So down the left-hand side, I've got a list of resources. So I've got 38 resources in there. And each one of those is named by what it is in terms of the service, not what it is in terms of its purpose in my application, as it were. But you'll also notice I have 0 variables and 39 parameters. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of parameters, and just a couple more for a laugh. Because it doesn't really understand how to build a nice human-readable template. To deploy a resource, it has to have certain information, so basically I get that echoed back as a set of parameters. So it's a really nice starter for 10. So I can come over here, I can Control-A, Control-C, Control-V that template into my editor of choice, and then butcher it like crazy to make it meet all of the rules that I've just talked to you about. The tricky bit, though, is sometimes the resource providers go, nah, mate, I haven't actually got any JSON to give you. And you get error messages. So a little thing, there we go, up here. 3 resource types cannot be exported yet and are not included in the template. That wasn't very helpful, was it? So if you just look at using the automation script, you might well find that there are things that don't appear in there. Now, the thing is that just because they don't appear in the automation script, that doesn't mean that you can't include them in a template. You just have to go looking for them. Enter stage left, Resource Explorer. As with all the best tools, Resource Explorer was built by a bloke on one of the teams in Azure. I think it was the App Services team, wasn't it, Magnus? One of those sort of over a weekend, I can't find anything to do what I want, I'll write it. And it's sort of grown from there. It also exists in the Azure portal, but the version in the Azure portal is, let's say, not as good, and leave it at that. It tells you different stuff. It presents the same information in a different way. You can find certain things in it, you can't find certain things in it. It's easier just to come to this. The great thing about this is, you can see here that I've logged in. Down the left-hand side, this very, very long expanding list, it shows me all my subscriptions. And I can expand that, and it shows me all my resource groups. And I can keep going down. I can find the Igloo 1 resource group. And inside that, it shows me all the providers that are sitting inside that resource group with services. And then I can expand down and go, aha, well, I want a website. I've got a couple of websites in there. Click on the site, and in the right-hand side, I get the JSON for it. And I can keep expanding down. So inside the website, the nice thing about this is if you deploy things like virtual machines with extensions and that kind of stuff, you can find JSON sitting in this tree view that the automation script won't hand you. After a little bit of trial and error, and to be fair, it is a bit of trial and error, you can sort of feel your way around how best to use this. You can copy the JSON that Resource Explorer shows you and use that in your template. There was a really good example of this that they've now fixed. I did some work for a customer who wanted to deploy Elastic SQL as part of their solution. And there was no documented way to deploy a SQL database as part of an elastic pool. So I went rummaging inside Resource Explorer and found the one property that I had to set to relate the database to the elastic pool, when I wonder what happens if I stick this in my template, and lo and behold, it worked. So it's a fantastic, fantastic tool. The other thing that I love Resource Explorer for is, so this is a view of a totally different resource group. I'm just going to scroll down. So I do a lot of work with virtual machines and desired state configuration and PowerShell script extensions. When you deploy your virtual machine for the first time, it fires up, it installs the desired state extension. It starts configuring the desired state. This is wonderful, but I cannot see what's going on. I can't remote into the box because it hasn't finished configuring. I can't tell if it's failed. I can't tell if it's succeeded. What this is displaying is something called instance view, and those of you with keen eyes will be able to see that that's basically showing you standard out and standard error from the script. So if you come into your virtual machine in the left-hand side and find instance view, Resource Explorer caches it, so you've got to poke it every sort of 30 seconds or so. But all those extensions that you install on your VM that are emitting logging output, it all shows up in the instance view. So you can peer into that black box and debug the code that previously was a complete nightmare because you've got to wait for ages to deploy the VM, then climb in, then find the logs. You can see it all in real time. It's brilliant. Okie dokie. Just to close the loop a little bit, I'm going to come back to the portal and show you the other Resource Explorer. So again, if you look in the Everything menu on the left-hand side, you'll find Resource Explorer. And it's really similar in that I can click down and I can find my subscriptions, and I can keep expanding my resource groups, and all of that lot. The one thing that I find useful in this Resource Explorer, the Resource Explorer website doesn't let you get at the template that was used for a deployment. Resource Explorer does, which is quite handy. Having said that, I will show you another way of doing that. So let me just go into my Igloo 1. The great thing about Azure is when you buy services, they're provisioned using resource templates. So if you come into your resource group and look for the deployments option, you can click and see all of the deployment operations that have taken place on that resource group. And you'll see up here that says Microsoft.template. And I can select that. And it shows me the outputs from the template. So in this one, I've got it defined. There we go, that's better. I've got it defined that it will emit the FQDNF Traffic Manager, the storage key for the storage account, all that kind of stuff. Screen grab quickly and try and abuse, because this is going to get blown away at the end of the session. And what inputs I specified. And importantly, I can click View Template, and it will fish the original template out that built the resource group, which is a slightly more manageable 6 parameters and a bunch of variables, for example. So it's a really great way of having a look at what other people have built to deploy their stuff. And then you Control-C, Control-V it. Okie dokie. Now that's all well and good. Deploying resources is easy. But what about when we want to do clever, cool stuff? What if I want lots of something? If I want, for example, in the template that I've just used, I've got 2 websites. Well, actually, if I enter lots and lots of regions as the parameter, I'll get as many websites as I enter regions. I don't want to have to put all of those resources in the template, particularly if I don't know the number I'm going to deploy. Enter stage left, copy, which does what it says on the tin. So I can say, as you can see there, I can enter a count, a name, and it will build as many instances of the JSON that I've got in for that resource as I put in count. So if you look in the code for the template that I deployed earlier, which is in my GitHub, lots and lots of resources in there are building themselves through a copy because the number of instances will depend on how many regions I'm pushing out to. So we can end up with quite a nice, simple template that actually puts out a lot more resources in terms of production than we actually have in the template itself. And importantly, that still follows my rule that we can use the same template for a dev. A dev gets one of something, and then production gets, I don't know, 1,500, however much we can afford or we want for resilience. The next bit is sequencing. So I said before that a template is declarative, so it effectively defines the end state of the resources. Well, that's okay, but what if, because of what I'm deploying, I actually need to change the state of something that I've deployed at the beginning of my template, shall we say, as we get further on? And the best example I have of that one that we do a lot is when you deploy a virtual network, the DNS address that gets handed out to virtual machines is an Azure DNS. If I then deploy virtual machines into that and I turn one of them into a domain controller, I want all the domain members to use it as their DNS so they can find the domain, so they can find resources in the domain, which means I need to reconfigure that virtual network to change the DNS address. I also need to make sure that I tell it the address that the DC, domain controller, has been handed by Azure. And maybe I want to change that address from dynamic when it first got it to static. So to do that, I use nested deploys. Within a template, you can define dependencies. So you can say, you know what, don't deploy the virtual machine until the virtual network's been created, because otherwise it's going to fail. If you extend that a bit so that rather than deploying a resource, you call a nested resource, you can start to reconfigure things. It has to be a nested resource because you cannot define the same resource twice in a template, which kind of makes sense. So when I'm doing virtual machines, I have a template that calls a template to create my virtual network and hands some information back to the master. Then it calls a template that deploys my domain controller, which hands back the IP address of the domain controller to the master template, which then calls a template to apply the new configuration to my virtual network. The only difference between the first template and the second is that the DNS address is different. So the template goes and looks at the existing virtual network and says, well, it's already created. All of these properties are right except that one, and it changes the DNS address. And then all of my other virtual machines depend on that virtual network and get the correct information for when they deploy. Now, to an extent, that's counterintuitive, because normally when we're building templates, what we're trying to do is to deploy as fast as possible, and sequencing obviously slows us down. But my preference, if I can, is to try and do as much of this in the template and the template sequencing, rather than to try and deploy stuff, then do a bit of scripting, then deploy another template, or try, sort of change the state of things using PowerShell. As far as I'm concerned, I want to use the template to get all of my resources out there as my base application host, if you like, and then the code goes on top. I don't really want to have to muck about with deploy a few resources, muck about with some scripting, then deploy a few more. Not long ago, the great gods in the ARM team also introduced conditionals, and we love them for it. So the template that is my example, if I only specify one region in my parameter, then why do I need Traffic Manager? So in the Traffic Manager JSON, there's a condition at the top that basically says, if there's only one element in the web locations array, don't deploy this. And I did that, and it was brilliant. My template crashed. I went, hang on a minute, what's going on? And then I realized that, so the ARM guys are really clever. And they will make sure that if I have something which depends on Traffic Manager before it deploys, they'll take care of all of that. So the deployment of the next resource won't fail. What they can't do, though, is help me out with a reference to a property of a non-existent resource. And you remember I showed you the outputs of that template. I'm passing back the Traffic Manager FQDN, except it doesn't exist, so it crashes. So for that one, I'm using if in the value. And for those of us that know and love Excel and how Excel does ifs, it's exactly the same. Lots of brackets and commas. If, test. What do you do if it's true? What do you do if it's false? So basically what that JSON does is say, well, if there's more than one item in the web locations array, then I know I'm going to have Traffic Manager. So hand back a value which is a reference to the property of the Traffic Manager. And if it isn't, if I've got if I've got one, not more than one, hand back null. At which point, the resource template parser doesn't die because that's completely valid. So the moral is, if you're using conditions to deploy resources, you will almost certainly find you have to have some kind of partnering if statement for what you're doing to join those resources to other things. And then, as I mentioned earlier with Resource Explorer, there's quite a lot of undocumented stuff. It's a source of, shall we say, disappointment that the guys in the Azure product teams tend to get their service running before they've built all the code that emits the templates properly. And usually before they've written the documentation as well, bless them, because we love them like that. So Resource Explorer, if you are sitting on the pointy bleeding edge of trying to deploy new services for your shiny project, you will find that Resource Explorer is absolutely your friend for looking at the stuff that you've deployed and working out what JSON you're going to need. How are we doing for time? So, a quick show you complex resource templates, because I think I've got about 5 minutes left, right? So, this is Visual Studio, which I realize might be a shock to the IT pros in the audience. So Visual Studio is my preferred editing tool for resource templates, and the reason I like it is basically because of this tooling. Visual Studio Code is great, and there are some nice extensions that do scaffolding of ARM templates and all kinds of clever stuff. But if you're going to edit code, use a real IDE, you know? Anyway, this template has a bunch of parameters, and hopefully you will see that I'm following all of my own rules. I've got a default value, I've got a description. For some of them, I've got allowed values. So if somebody types something in that's outside the bounds of what I want to permit, I can prevent that. But I've got a small number of them. There are only 6. I try and keep it well below double figures if I can. If I look at variables, that says I've got 9 variables. If you actually look at those variables, again, following my rules. So I've got a Redis cache which has a bunch of properties. And if I come down to my resources and just have a look at Redis cache, you can see here that I access those by doing variables Redis cache .skew name for the property of the thing that I want. I find that really easy to read. I don't know about you, so I beat the devs on the back of the head if they just give me a long list of variables. We try and put some structure on there to help us manage it. And then similarly, when I look at my resources, the resources in here are showing me the tag name rather than the computed variables, yada, 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 that it's going to use to name the resource. Yeah.
What you have to do, display name.
Yeah, it's got to be display name. So you can see that I've got Redis cache in the left-hand side. I've got a tag that says display name Redis cache. And the tooling reads that and shows it there. Now, to be fair, that's kind of unique to the Visual Studio tooling. So it's why I use Visual Studio in the Azure SDK, and it's why I put that tag in there. If you don't care about Visual Studio, then you probably don't care about display name. But you should use Visual Studio, right? And then finally, down here in outputs, I'm handing back the information that I need. What I'm not going to show you now, because I haven't got a great deal of time, if you look in my GitHub, in the resource templates repo, there's this one, which is a single template, which is a fairly complex template that's got conditionals, it's got copy loops, it does all kinds of clever stuff. There's another set of templates in there which shows you how to do nested resources and sequencing, and that deploys 3 virtual machines with all of the stuff that I was talking about deploying networks first, then VMs to reconfigure and that kind of stuff. I suppose it's quite sad that I get excited over resource templates, but you know, I'm an IT pro, so all we get is sort of infrastructure as code and PowerShell. That's as far as I go. I don't get to play with all the funky languages that you guys do. Right, let us come back to the plot. So why are we building these things? We're building them because we want to automate our deployment. We're building them for our release pipelines. We're building them to enable DevOps in the organization. So for that reason, stuff that I was talking about before, big rule number 1, don't build more than one template for your application for dev and then test and then release. You'd be surprised how often people want to do that. Only last week I was sitting in with a customer going, no, back away from the keyboard. One template, parameters and choices. Because if we're not using the same template, we've not tested, have we? You know, if we use a different template for production than we do for test, we haven't tested. I love PowerShell when I'm deploying stuff. What I normally find is I've got a PowerShell window next to me that I just sort of hit to do the deploy. The reason I like PowerShell is because if you do a resource group deployment command, it reads the template, looks at the parameters in the template, and infers command line switches for that deployment command, so I can specify the answers to my parameters. The Visual Studio release task, because under the hood it's using PowerShell, does exactly the same thing. So when you come to your release pipeline, I don't really care what you're using for release. I mean, I use release management in VSTS. You could use Chef, you could use Puppet, you could use PowerShell, whatever. Store those parameters as release variables or whatever your system uses to store the configuration on an environment basis. Don't, whatever you do, put a config file into source control, because that will bite you on the ass, I guarantee it. Look at that, almost just exactly on time. So, Ryan Jones, unfortunately, is no longer the demigod of resource templates. However, first of all, his GitHub is full of sample templates that are specifically focused on things that the ARM language, as it were, does. So if you want an example of using if or conditions, that kind of stuff, Ryan's your man. I would normally say tweet him questions because he'll answer them. He now works in the Dynamics team. So I'll say, tweet him ARM templates, because it'd be funny. If he's mad enough to go work on Dynamics, then you know we should keep giving him the ARM template love. Links you'll find useful. The Azure Quick Start templates, there's 2 ways you can get at them. Straight through GitHub or through a Microsoft site that allows you to search. They're fantastic examples of how to do stuff. Do not for a second believe they are necessarily reference documentation, because a lot of them aren't, but they're a great source of learning. There is documentation on ARM templates. That's on docs.microsoft.com. And importantly, resources.azure.com is where you want to go for Resource Explorer. And with that, I will say, are there any questions in the about 30 seconds I've got left? No? Brilliant. Well, in which case, thank you very much for putting up with me, and hopefully you've all woken up now for whoever's on next.